This is 2 Maccabees 4. The previously mentioned Simon, who had informed about the money against his own country, slandered Onias, saying that it was he who had incited Heliodorus and had been the real cause of the misfortune. He dared to designate as a plotter against the government a man who was the benefactor of the city, the protector of his fellow countrymen, and a zealot for the laws. When his hatred progressed to such a degree that even murderers were committed by one of Simon's approved agents, Onias recognized that the rivalry was serious and that Apollonius, the son of menesthus and governor of Syria and Phoenicia, was intensifying the malice of Simon. So he betook himself to the king, not accusing his fellow citizens, but having in view the welfare, both public and private, of all the people. For he saw that without the king's attention, public affairs could not again reach a peaceful settlement, and that Simon would not stop his folly. When Seleucus died and Antiochus, who was called Epiphanes, succeeded to the kingdom, Jason, the brother of Onias, obtained the priesthood by corruption, promising the king at an interview 360 talents of silver, and from another source of revenue, 80 talents. In addition to this, he promised to pay 150 more if permission were given to establish by his authority a gymnasium and a body of youth for it, and to enroll the men of Jerusalem as citizens of Antioch. When the king assented and Jason came to office, he at once shifted his countrymen over to the Greek way of life. He set aside the existing royal concessions to the Jews, secured through John, the father of Elopimus, who went on the mission to establish friendship and alliance with the Romans. And he destroyed the lawful ways of living and introduced new customs contrary to the law. For with all alacrity, I've never heard that word before, A-L-A-C-R-I-T-Y. For with alacrity, he founded a gymnasium right under the citadel. And he introduced the noblest of the young men to wear the Greek hat. There was such an extreme of Hellenization, an increase in the adoption of foreign ways because of the surpassing wickedness of Jason, who was ungodly and no high priest, that the priests were no longer intent upon their service at the altar. Despising the sanctuary and neglecting the sacrifices, they hastened to take part in the unlawful proceedings in the wrestling arena. After the call to the discuss, disdaining the honors prized by their fathers, and putting the highest value upon the Greek forms of prestige. For this reason, heavy disaster overtook them, and those whose ways of living they admired and wished to imitate completely became their enemies and punished them. For there is no light thing to show irreverence to the divine laws, a fact which later events will make clear. When the quadrennial games were being held at Tyre, and the king was present, the vile Jason sent envoys, chosen as being Antiochian citizens from Jerusalem, to carry 300 silver drachmas for the sacrifice to Hercules. Those who carried the money, however, thought best not to use it for sacrifice, because that was inappropriate, but to expend it for another purpose. So this money was intended by the sender for the sacrifice to Hercules, but by the decision of its own carriers, it was applied to the construction of triremes. This is spelled Triremes. When Apollonius, the son of Menesthus, was sent to Egypt for the coronation of Philometor as king, Antiochus learned that Philometor had become hostile to his government, and he took measures for his own security. Therefore, upon arriving at Joppa, he proceeded to Jerusalem. He was welcomed magnificently by Jason, and the city ushered in with a blaze of torches and shouts. Then he marched into Phoenicia. After a period of 3 years, Jason sent Menesthus, the brother of the previously mentioned Simon, to carry the money to the king to complete the record of essential businesses. But he, when presented to the king, extolled him with the air of authority and secured the high priesthood for himself, outbidding Jason by 300 talents of silver. After receiving the king's orders, he returned, possessing no qualification for the high priesthood and having a hot temper of a cruel tyrant and the rage of a savage wild beast. So, Jason, who, after supplanting his own brother, was supplanted by another man, was driven as a fugitive into the land of Ammon. And Menesthus held the office, but he did not pay regularly any of the money promised to the king. When Sostratus, the captain of the citadel, kept requesting the payment, for the collection of the revenue was his responsibility, 2 of them were summoned by the king on account of this issue. Menesthus left his own brother Lysimachus as deputy in the high priesthood, while Sostratus left Crates, the commander of the Cyprian troops. While such state was the state of affairs, it happened that the people of Taurus and of Malus revolted because their cities had been given as a present to Antiochus, the king's concubine. So the king went hastily to settle the trouble, leaving Andronicus, a man of high rank, to act as his deputy. But Menesthus, thinking he had obtained a suitable opportunity, stole some of the gold vessels of the temple and gave them to Andronicus. Other vessels, as it happened, he had sold to Tyre and neighboring cities. When Onias became fully aware of these acts, he publicly exposed them, having first withdrawn to a place of sanctuary at Daphne near Antioch. Therefore, Menesthus took Andronicus aside and urged him to kill Onias. Andronicus came to Onias and, resorting to treachery, offered him sworn pledges and gave him his right hand, and in spite of his suspicion, persuaded Onias to come out from the place of the sanctuary. Then, with no regard for justice, he immediately put him out of the way. For this reason, not only Jews, but many also of other nations were grieved and displeased at the unjust murder of the man. When the king returned from the region of Cilicia, the Jews in the city appealed to him with regard to an unreasonable murder of Onias, and the Greeks shared their hatred of the crime. Therefore Antioch was grieved at heart and filled with pity and wept because of the moderation and good conduct of the deceased. And inflamed with anger, he immediately stripped off the purple robe from Andronicus, tore off his garments, and led him about the whole city to that very place where he had committed the outrage against Onias. And there he dispatched the bloodthirsty fellow. The Lord thus repaid him with the punishment he deserved. When many acts of sacrilege had been committed in the city by Lysimachus, with the connivance of Menesthus. When report of them had spread abroad, the populace gathered against Lysimachus, because many of the gold vessels had already been stolen. Since the crowds were becoming aroused and filled with anger, Lysimachus armed about 3,000 men and launched an unjust attack under the leadership of a certain Auroranus, a man advanced in years and no less advanced in folly. But when the Jews became aware of Lysimachus' attack, picked up stones, some blocks of wood, and others took handful of ashes that were lying and threw them in wild confusion at Lysimachus and his men. As a result, they wounded many of them and killed some and put them all in flight. And the temple robber himself they killed close by the treasury. Charges were brought against Menesthus about this incident. When the king came to Tyre, 3 men sent by the Senate presented the case before him. But Menesthus, already as good as beaten, promised a substantial bribe to Ptolemy, son of Dorymenes, to win over the king. Therefore Ptolemy, taking the king aside into a colonnade as if for refreshment, induced the king to change his mind. Menesthus, the cause of all the evil, he acquitted of the charges against him, while he sentenced to death those unfortunate men who would have been freed uncondemned if they had pleaded even before Psychopathes. And so those who had spoken for the city and the villages and the holy vessels quickly suffered the unjust penalty. Therefore, even the Tyrrhenians showed their hatred of the crime, provided magnificently for the funeral. But Menesthus, because of the cupidity of those in power, remained in office, growing in wickedness, having become the chief plotter against his fellow citizens.